Well, hello, I'm Ben Felder, editor-in-chief at Investigate Midwest, and I'm joined by Melissa Dai, who has been one of our reporting interns for this summer. You've been doing some great work, including kind of your big story, at least one of your big stories that recently published. Headline is Faster Lines, Less Federal Oversight, and Rising Risks at U.S. Pork and Poultry Plants. And you really kind of dived into kind of the inspection process at poultry and pork plants and kind of how things are changing, how some federal regulations have been changing. I guess I wanted to see if you could start off by talking a little bit about a consumer safety inspector. That's kind of an important person or important position in your reporting. Tell us a little bit about what that person does.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a consumer safety inspector is a federal inspector. So, it's part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Food Safety and Inspection Service, FSIS. FSI inspectors, there are two types, and they're stationed at every plant that produces meat, poultry, and eggs that enter the food system. So, there are two types, like I mentioned. One of them is a food inspector. And this is a traditional model. Those are online. So they're actually on the lines, kind of getting their hands dirty by inspecting every animal part that passes by. So you'll see them making cuts, stuff like that, to inspect these carcasses for food safety. And then we have consumer safety inspectors, the one you mentioned. They operate both on the lines and off the lines, like kind of wherever they're needed, according to the main former consumer safety inspector I spoke to for the story. And they're either doing tasks on the lines, so again, like making those cuts, inspecting every part of the carcass, or they'll be stationed off the lines, doing like food safety verification tasks like sanitation checks, hazard checks, record keeping, stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think most people are probably under the assumption that their food is inspected in some way. And we probably have this image of someone sitting at kind of a conveyor belt watching, and that may be more about like what we've seen in cartoons growing up. But I mean, one, your story did a really good job kind of unpacking a little bit about what these positions do. And as you said, it's more than just spotting problems. I mean, there's cutting into the carcasses and stuff like that. But the role, the federal requirements for these positions have been changing over the years through this process that's been called modernization. And obviously, it's kind of a positive word. I know you and I even talked about it early in the reporting process about how to present this word because obviously the industry, and we'll get to this in a second, kind of sees this as a positive, but it's been presented as this modernization approach. What does that look like? How are things changing when it comes to food inspection at these plants?
Modernization is kind of twofold. So the first thing that happens is faster line speeds. That's kind of been at the forefront of conversations about modernization. But another key part of it is, like you mentioned, shifts in inspections and how inspections operate. So initial under modernization at modernized plants, initial inspection tasks have shifted from federal inspectors who, like I mentioned, at traditional plants are on the lines and actually making the cuts and everything. It's shifted from that to private employees, which the government and industry groups call sorters. So the process of sorting is essentially what FSIS inspectors previously did on the lines. So analyzing the meat for like defects and then cutting those defects off. So they actually have their hands on the meat and poultry. Um, and companies are now in charge of training these sorters. So they're in charge of hiring and training the sorters. And FSIS does not actually mandate like a specific training for the sorters. They merely like provide guidelines. So now that we have company employees in charge of like initial inspection tasks, we move the federal inspectors at these modernized plants to the ends of the lines. So now there's only one at the end of each line and they're hands off. So they're not actually like getting their hands on the meat and making cuts or anything. They're merely like analyzing the meat visually and flagging anything that they catch. So the federal inspector that I spoke to, the former one, talked about how this is beneficial because he no longer had to worry about kind of like the gritty tasks of like sharpening knives and sanitizing and all of that. Now he could just focus on the meat, but it brings a bunch of other problems as well. And there was kind of some debate about whether inspection tasks have actually shifted. So in 2019, when the swine program launched, the Washington Post did some reporting on modernization and what it kind of means. And in that reporting, the reporters claim that inspection tasks have shifted, and the FSIS at the time, under the first Trump administration, came back pretty hard against that. They responded essentially calling the Washington Post's reporting irresponsible. It's a little comical how they responded. If you take a look at their press release, they they tell the Washington Post that they deserve Pinocchios for like lying in their reporting. Um, it was a very insistent and intense response. And in response to that, the Washington Post reporter, the same one, did a follow-up story doubling down that even if inspection tests may not have changed like on paper or in name, as the FSIS insisted they don't, in practice, inspection tasks have actually shifted to like private companies under modernization. And I spoke to an official at Wayne Sanderson Farms, which is the nation's third largest poultry producer. Um, and he kind of confirmed that the responsibility for of like initial inspections has shifted from federal inspectors to private employees. He like confirmed that there was that handoff in duties. As he described it, it was those initial inspection tasks are in the realm of like quality assurance,
Right.
whereas federal inspectors are still in charge of food safety. So he's saying that like modernization puts quality assurance back in the hands of companies, and then it keeps federal inspectors in charge of food safety, which may be true, may not be true, but either way, it signals a clear shift in inspection duties.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about kind of the pushback from the federal government over that initial reporting from the Post, and I mean, it makes sense why there'd be a lot of defensiveness in this. I mean, it's a big deal when you make these kind of changes, right? Because, like I said, I mean, inspecting the nation's food system. I mean, I think most Americans feel like they expect their foods to be safe and free of disease and other ailments, and so. Um, when you talk about shifts and maybe responsibilities being dropped, I mean, there can be a lot of concern, rightfully so, and a lot of fear there. Yeah, tell me a little bit more about your conversation with a leader over at Wayne Sanderson. I thought it was I mean, I thought that was a great addition to your story. I mean, kind of talking about what they do at their facility. And, in some ways, they made a compelling case for why that they are able to fill in the gap and able to take on more of this responsibility. I think the main question is every company able to do that? This is just one company's example, but tell me a little bit more about kind of what you learned about the process there and kind of the response that they had.
Yeah, absolutely. So I found it really hard throughout the reporting process to get like actual current perspectives from companies. Wayne Sanderson was one of the only ones that I could actually get in touch with. So yeah, it was a really valuable addition to my reporting. And the conversation, I talked to their senior vice president of quality assurance and food safety. That might be a little, the title might not be exactly that, but it's something around there. And he essentially said that modernization ultimately was a really good thing because he seemed to be really strict with his employees in that he would hire sorters, like these
Mhm.
employees in charge of initial inspections. He hired sorters, and he stood firm that it was a good thing that those responsibilities were now under like a private umbrella because his team could personally enforce more accountability in the inspection process, whereas previously, because the inspections fell entirely under federal inspectors' purview, he didn't really have the power to I guess like kind of veto power, as in if a federal inspector claimed it was one thing and he and his team thought it was something else, they didn't really have the power to dispute that previously. Now they do, which again speaks to a shift in oversight. But in his case, he said it was a good thing because he could hold his sorters more accountable and just ensure that the entire process was up to his standards.
Yeah,
And he described like the training process as well, for his sorters at Wayne Sanderson. So they do annual recertifications, which he claimed were actually more strict than the FSIS inspector training process. And the this like contrasts what the FSIS inspector I spoke to said, because he said he described his training process, he described it as extremely intensive, very rigorous, and not a lot of people make it through because of how intensive it is. And he described at the modernized plants where he worked, the sorters underwent a training that was not nearly as rigorous. But then at Wayne Sanderson, this official said that the training was actually more rigorous because it was just annual recertifications. Like these sorters had to go through this entire like exam process every single year.
yeah.
Uh,
And that may be a good example maybe of this shift and how it can be both a benefit to the company, but also how, like you said, that they can still maintain high standards if that is in fact the case. But again, this is just one company's example, right? So when you give more power and control to these companies, you're probably going to have kind of a mix on how these corporations, these facilities approach this. What were some of the major criticisms? I mean, you hit on them already, but when you talk to people, who'd worked in this industry or worked around it, people who've worked on the lines, that were critical of this modernization shift. What were some of their major concerns?
Yeah, so one of the major concerns was like the shift in federal oversight. Like you said, even if this one company that I spoke with, Wayne Sanderson, had practices and policies that were kind of above board and really committed to food safety, ensuring food safety, companies that might not have those same priorities still have the power to operate how they want to operate, and that can be really problematic, especially for food safety. So in my story, I kind of explored three primary problems. The first was food safety, and that flexibility and that privatization of like inspections was a really key component of that, because companies now have more power than like the federal inspectors trained to maintain food safety and trained to be watchdogs for at these like privately owned plants. So that was a primary problem area. And the several accounts of former and current inspectors, said that like the priorities of the private employees tasked with sorting may not have been in line with like food safety. So some of those accounts described how employees have tried to like sneak defects by just to keep the lines moving because again, they have more like private interests. So yeah, that was one primary concern for critics of modernization. Another one is worker injury. So faster line speeds. This is more focused on the faster line speeds because the lines are moving faster. A lot of workers and advocates claim that injury risk is higher with faster lines and like not enough staff. And there were two government commission studies. I can talk about those more
Yep.
later. There were two government commission studies that were published in January. They were called the Pulse studies, one for poultry and one for swine, and they explored the rates of evisceration lines. So evisceration lines are the the process of like organ removal and cleaning and inspections at swine and poultry plants. So both these studies looked at the correlation between evisceration line speeds and musculoskeletal disorder risk among workers. So the poultry study, published in January, found no associations between evisceration line speeds and musculoskeletal disorder risk, whereas the swine one found conflicting evidence. So at one plant, there was a correlation between higher speeds and MSD risk. But then at another plant, there was like a negative correlation. So The evidence on evisceration line speeds, which modernization industry groups are very adamant that modernization only affects evisceration lines. Since evisceration lines are the only like point of the process that are increasing in line speeds under modernization, industry groups claim that these studies show no correlation in like just no increased risk of injury from modernization, modernized line speed changes. Still, advocates remain adamant that line speeds increase pressure on workers at all points of the process because you also see that argument with animal welfare, which is the third main problem area that critics identify with modernization. So even though it's only like the post-mortem process of evisceration that's sped up under modernization, I think a source from the Humane League told me in a statement that this increases pressure on the entire system because if you're increasing the rate of one point of processing, then there are ripple effects for the rest of the process. And there was a lawsuit about this that I describe in my reporting. Advocates claim that like faster line speeds and decrease in federal oversight leads to more animals being mistreated by workers who kind of struggle to keep up with this faster pace. And the Washington Post also reported in 2013, I think it was, that 1 million chickens were boiled alive that year, partly due to like faster lines. So there are a lot of issues with humane practices as well as a result of modernization. And that, I mean, that's what advocates and critics claim.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, anytime you make changes like this, obviously there's an impact on the workers, there's an impact on the animals. But a reason why I think people, from all walks of life and all communities should be interested in your articles because it also has an impact on the food that we eat and and the safety of our food. And so I just thought your story did a great job of kind of diving into this shift, this modernization shift. Good perspective from both sides. And then also mention, a nice kind of timeline interactive timeline that can help kind of readers understand kind of this process that we've been under to get to this shift. So, and Melissa, great job on the reporting. I really appreciate it. Readers can find it at investigatemidwest.org. Melissa, thanks so much for talking about your story.
Of course. And one more thing,
Yeah, please.
if anyone's curious about the timeline, go to the citations and references of my story because it's a very detailed list of like all the developments that have happened with modernization over the years.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's a good plug for the citation list that's at the end of all of our stories. Readers can get additional information about the sources that you use, the people that you interviewed, and other documents and materials. So I appreciate that. Thanks, Melissa.
Of course.